We often think we know what a wealthy company looks like in our modern world. We look at the titans of industry that shape our daily lives and technology. Tesla reached a huge milestone recently as an electric automaker. It is now valued at more than $1 trillion in the stock market. Apple became the first publicly traded company to break the 3 trillion barrier. Even Google's parent company Alphabet has recorded similar landmark capitalizations. They are all trillion-dollar enterprises dominating their respective fields, absolutely. But none of them are the correct answer to the question of true power. The real answer might actually shock you if you look back in time. The Dutch East India Company was an entity unlike anything we know today. It operated less like a business and more like a sovereign nation. It possessed its own private military forces to enforce its will. It minted its own currency to control the flow of local economies. It even held the power to declare war independently of the state. At its absolute peak of power and influence in the world, its value was estimated at nearly $8 trillion in today's money. So what exactly helped the Dutch East India Company rise so high? How did it become the most powerful commercial empire in history? And why did such a titan vanish without a trace from modern maps? Today it is easy for you to buy a jar of black pepper. It costs mere pennies at a local grocery store or market. In many restaurants, this spice is provided entirely for free. But if we turn the clock back several centuries to the past, these spices were viewed by European nobility as precious treasures. To reach the dining tables of the wealthy and powerful elite, spices from across the globe had to travel thousands of kilometers. They passed through the hands of Arab and Chinese merchants. The price was inflated dozens of times before reaching the final buyer. Yet thanks to their ability to create unique flavors for food, they remained incredibly popular despite the exorbitant costs involved. The spice trade therefore became a lucrative commercial industry. It continued to develop stronger and faster with each passing year. In May of 1453, a catastrophe occurred. Constantinople fell into the hands of the expanding Ottoman Empire. This city sat at the strategic crossroads connecting Europe and Asia. Controlling Constantinople meant controlling the flow of all spice. The Ottomans now mastered the transit of silk and rare goods. Immediately after their victory, the taxes were raised significantly. Tariffs went up 3 to 4 times their previous levels overnight. The price of pepper and nutmeg and cinnamon became astronomical. The profit margins for European merchants were severely narrowed. Yet the demand for luxury in Europe continued to explode. Worse still was the political instability and constant looting. Land trade routes became incredibly dangerous due to endless wars. A solution to this logistical nightmare was desperately needed. Europe at that time was witnessing a period of strong development. Populations were growing fast and urban areas were expanding rapidly. Shipbuilding technology and navigation began to make great leaps. The unification of nations after civil wars created political stability. Nations began to turn their attention toward grand expeditions. The fall of Constantinople created an urgent problem for them. It became the main driving force behind the Age of Discovery. In this new era, Portugal took the lead under Prince Henry. With superior maritime advantages, they achieved great success quickly. In 1488, they rounded the Cape of Good Hope. This opened the door connecting the Atlantic to the Indian Ocean. A decade later, Vasco da Gama docked in Calicut in India. He opened a direct sea route to the massive spice supplies. However, this was only the beginning of their dominance. To establish a solid position in the global trade network, Portugal utilized its advantages in weapons and ships fully. They waged war along the maritime routes to secure control. They built fortified strongholds to monitor surrounding seas. Starting in Cochin in 1503, they expanded. Wars spread to Goa and Malacca and Hormuz in Colombo. Merchant ships passing through the area were forced to join convoys. Theoretically, this was a measure to prevent piracy at sea. But in reality, it forced ships to pay heavy tariffs. Thus, Portugal held the monopoly on spice distribution in Europe. But that monopoly would soon be broken by an unexpected force. The Netherlands had been under foreign rule for many centuries. In 1549, Charles V united the region. The Netherlands and Belgium and Luxembourg became the 17 provinces. Politically, they were bound under suppression and foreign control. But the Dutch Republic rose to become a great sea power. The reason for this rise was geographically very clear. The Netherlands sits right at the gateway of Northern Europe. Large rivers flow into the North Sea, creating trade hubs. This turned the land into a vital link on the map. Urbanization happened here very early compared to neighbors. The population was dense and the ports were always bustling. A dense network of canals connected every part of the region. The most prominent city was Antwerp in the south. It sat at a strategic trade crossroad connecting to France. It linked the Holy Roman Empire to the North Sea trade. It became the economic capital of the entire northern region. Since the early 16th century, Portugal used Antwerp. It was a transit point for pepper and Asian spices. Dutch merchants bought spices from the Portuguese to distribute. They sent goods to other markets across the European continent. Bustling trade created admirable prosperity for the city. However, that prosperity hit a wall of politics. Religious conflict began to tear the region apart from within. In 1566, Dutch Protestants rose up in anger. They destroyed statues and churches regarding them as oppression. King Philip II of Spain responded with brutal force. He established the Council of Blood to punish the rebels. Riots broke out everywhere and tensions escalated daily. The exit to the Scheldt River was completely blocked off. This ended the role of Antwerp as a trade center. Wealthy merchants fled to other cities to escape the chaos. In this migration, they brought their wealth and knowledge. They moved to a new land that would soon rise up. Amsterdam in the north received this influx of resources. It quickly rose to become the new gateway of trade. Portugal had lost an important market in the south, but difficulties did not stop there for the Portuguese. English pirates began harassing the South Atlantic seas. Merchant ships carrying spices became fewer and fewer. In 1591, an international alliance was formed. Portuguese and Spanish and Italian merchants gathered together. They wanted to solve this problem of distribution and safety. The transit point was gone, and the Netherlands was unstable. They wanted to turn Hamburg and Germany into a new hub. This would serve the spice distribution for all Northern Europe. But Dutch merchants were now in a great difficulty. They no longer had a source of spice to continue business. In addition, a major political event occurred in 1580. Portugal and Spain united into the Iberian Union. Under the rule of King Philip II of Spain, the Dutch were already in conflict with Spain for independence. Therefore, Portugal automatically became an enemy of the people. Merchants could not cooperate with the enemy of their homeland. They had only one single path left to take now. They had to cross the sea to Asia themselves. They had to get spices right at the source of production. Dutch merchants began to pool their capital together. They hired sailors and began building sturdy ships. But they lacked one crucial thing to make the journey. The route to Asia was a secret kept by Portugal. The Portuguese had blockaded the route around the Cape. Every merchant fleet needed a navy to survive the trip. Every merchant fleet needed a navy just to survive the dangerous trip. They required armed escorts and skilled navigators to guide them safely. But the nautical charts were kept as absolute military secrets by the state. For over a full century since the first voyage of Vasco da Gama, no other European nation could replicate that legendary journey to the east. The wall of Portuguese monopoly seemed almost impossible for anyone to breach. However, towards the end of the 16th century, everything changed rapidly. One single man decided to change the course of history forever. Jan Huygen van Linschoten was a Dutch merchant and a daring explorer. He once worked as a secretary for the Archbishop in Goa in India. That was the heart of the territory where Portugal held total control. During his years working there, Linschoten accessed deep secrets. He studied the supply chain of spices right at the source. He quietly copied the secret charts of ports and wind patterns. He recorded the transaction prices he overheard from the merchant fleets. When he returned to Amsterdam in 1595, he published a book. It was called the Itinerario, concerning the voyages to the east. It quickly became a treasure map for the Dutch merchant class. For the first time, they had clear instructions to cross the Indian Ocean. Every condition for the first independent voyage was finally ready to go. In 1595, Cornelis de Houtman was given command. He led 4 ships on a mission of immense historical importance. He was a merchant who had lived in Lisbon for some time. He possessed extensive knowledge of maritime affairs and trade routes. In April of that year, the fleet left the port of Texel. They carried about 250 sailors into the unknown. From the very first days, they encountered countless severe difficulties. Violent storms battered the wooden hulls of their small ships. Disease on the open sea caused many men to lose their lives. The morale of the crew was always in a state of extreme tension. Yet in June of 1596, they still succeeded in landing. They arrived at Bansum, which lies between Sumatra and Java in Indonesia. Here they made their first contact with the Sultanate of Bansum. This was the largest pepper trading center in the entire region. However, things did not go smoothly for the Dutch newcomers. The local leaders did not trust these strange foreign merchants. The Dutch were viewed as aggressive invaders rather than partners. Conflict broke out, forcing the fleet to retreat in haste. They left without securing any significant business deals or contracts. The fleet continued to skirt along the islands of Madura and Bali. Even there, they only collected a small amount of pepper. They found a few other rare spices to bring back home. Only 87 men remained alive when the journey finally ended. Yet the trip was proof that the Dutch could cross the ocean. It proved they could bring spices back to Europe on their own. Most importantly, the Portuguese monopoly was officially broken forever. During their time in Java, the crew saw no Portuguese flags. Asian merchants often tried to avoid the Portuguese tax system. They rejected the monopoly routes and refused to do business there. The opportunity for the Netherlands was now wide open for the taking. They could exploit this uncontrolled supply source for themselves. In 1598, the Dutch rushed to prepare new fleets. Among them was a fleet of 8 ships under Jacob van Neck. On the 1st of May, the fleet weighed anchor and departed. The route to the Cape of Good Hope was very favorable, but when passing Cape Agulhas at the southern tip of Africa, on the 8th of August, a massive storm split the fleet. Van Neck continued the journey with only 3 of his ships. On November 26, he docked at the port of Bantam. 5 weeks later, the remaining ships also arrived at the destination. By this time, Van Neck had bought enough goods to fill 4 ships. In January of 1599, they set sail back to the Netherlands. The return journey of Van Neck went incredibly smoothly for them. The entire trip took place in less than 15 months. It was so fast the Portuguese mocked them with rumors. They claimed the goods must have been stolen from other ships. Meanwhile, the remaining 4 ships were ordered to sail to the Moluccas. On the way, the group split into 2 smaller teams again. The first group went to Banda, which is part of the Moluccas. Negotiations there went favorably, and they signed a large agreement. They purchased a massive quantity of precious nutmeg for the company. They even established a permanent trading post right there on the island. This opened opportunities for many future voyages to come. The other group went to Ternate, the center of clove production. Purchasing was also extremely favorable for the second group, but the return journey was not smooth for them at all. They were harassed by Portuguese ships in many different areas. Disease also caused some members to not survive the trip. The conditions on the sea were harsh and unforgiving for everyone. It was not until September of 1600 that they arrived. Overall, the trip brought resounding success for the investors. Profits reached up to 400% for the shareholders. The Dutch had successfully found a new route and supply. Therefore, they no longer had to trade through Portuguese intermediaries. However, that was also when a new problem began to arise. At the ports, people fought each other fiercely for advantage. Everyone wanted to gain the upper hand in this new race. Shipbuilding costs skyrocketed as demand for vessels increased. Sailors' wages and weapon costs were pushed higher and higher. When Dutch merchants finally arrived in Asia to trade, instead of joining forces to fight against the Portuguese enemy, they fought each other over trading zones and prices. More importantly, another power began to eye this lucrative pie, facing the huge profits of the spice trade industry. The English refused to stand on the sidelines and watch. In the year 1600, they established the English East India Company. They granted it a royal monopoly on the Asian market. This meant only the English East India Company could trade there. Other English merchants could not do business on their own. They had to go through this company to participate at all. The Dutch knew they also needed to do something quickly. Lawyer and statesman Johan van Oldenbarnevelt realized this early on. He was famous for his sharp diplomatic skills and strategy. He had a great ability to plan for the long term. He successfully convinced opposing groups to cooperate with each other. And there was one more thing that promoted Dutch unity. That was the event known as the 80 Years' War. Since 1581, the 7 northern provinces had declared independence. They broke away from the King of Spain to be free. They established a new political entity called the Dutch Republic. Van Oldenbarnevelt saw that unifying domestic companies was key. It would create a strong financial source for the war effort. So he joined with Prince Maurice, the stadtholder of the provinces. They stood up to organize negotiations between the rival merchants. In 1602, at the city of Middelburg, a historic decision was finally made for the nation. From March 20th, the United East India Company was born. It was called the VOC, and it officially began operations. But how was the VOC different from previous companies? It was not just a fleet or a group of merchants. It was not even a business in the familiar sense. The VOC was a revolution in the world of commerce. The biggest difference lay in how it was organized. It was structured as a joint stock company for the first time. 7 chambers of commerce represented the major port cities. This included Amsterdam and Delft and Rotterdam and Zeeland. Hoorn and Enkhuizen were also established as chambers. At the head of each chamber was a managing director. They were responsible for raising capital and building ships. They equipped vessels and managed goods after each trip. Yet they still had to follow the company rules strictly. Leading the VOC was the Council of 17 Lords. This supreme body held the role of general policy planning. In the council, Amsterdam held 8 seats and Zeeland 4. The cities of Rotterdam and Delft each held 1 seat. The 17th seat was rotated among the smaller branches. This was to balance power and ensure fairness for all. It ensured they still had a voice in decision-making. It is easy to see that Amsterdam's influence was greatest. Business positions were also divided according to specific ratios. Amsterdam received half and Zeeland received 1/4. The rest was divided equally among the 4 small cities. The initial capital was contributed by wealthy merchants. To mobilize more financial resources, the VOC did something new. They offered shares to the general public for purchase. This policy was clearly recorded in Article 10 of the Charter. Investors decided the amount of money they spent themselves. There was no minimum or maximum level for investment. Even a maid could buy a piece of the empire. Before the VOC, there were already companies that issued stock to people. Their financial structure was modeled after shipping businesses in the southern Netherlands. They also copied the city-states of Italy, like Genoa and Venice. But they lacked the truly public nature of what was to come. The VOC was different because every Dutch citizen was invited to invest. This was completely different from the companies that came before it. Previous ventures only mobilized finance from a small group of insiders. Those groups usually had close personal ties to the company directors. However, the VOC did not yet have an official headquarters building, so investors in the Amsterdam branch were invited to a private home. They went to the house of the merchant Dirk van Oos to sign up. He was a co-founder of the company and hosted the registration. Throughout August of 1602, the house was busy. Van Oos and other directors took turns supervising the treasurer. They recorded every piece of information carefully into a large ledger. Initially, not everyone was excited about the VOC project. The existing businesses were already generating very good profits for them. Furthermore, the VOC was not just an economic pillar for the country. It was the backbone of the war for trade monopoly against Portugal. The cost to achieve that monopoly was going to be enormous. But the founders of the VOC were all famous and reputable merchants. Their prestige helped push hesitant investors to part with their money. Also, the fact that the government sponsored it helped. It gave the investors a sense of security and peace of mind. However, there was still another serious problem causing hesitation. The first article of the Charter had a very specific regulation. It stated the VOC had a monopoly on Asian trade for 21 years. This meant the company would exist for at least 2 decades. Commercial enterprises before this only lasted for a short time. Usually they ran for 3 to 4 years per expedition. When the fleet returned, the goods were auctioned off immediately. The company would dissolve, and if the ships were still good, they were sold to a new enterprise for the next voyage. Books were balanced, and investors took their profits right then. The long existence of the VOC created a liquidity problem. Getting money back would take a very long time for investors. To solve this situation, a temporary liquidation clause was created. It stated that after 10 years in 1612, accounts would settle. A general balance sheet would be drawn up for everyone to see. The financial situation would be made public to the shareholders, and shareholders would have the right to withdraw their capital. However, 10 years was still too long for many people. So, on the first page of the register, the founders added a note. They wrote a new clause that changed the financial world forever. Shares could be transferred to the treasurer of the branch. Thus, investors did not have to wait until 1612. They could get their money back by transferring shares anytime. The process was guided in detail for every shareholder to follow. The shareholder just had to meet the treasurer where they deposited. The transfer would be approved by 2 directors of the company. Information about transfers was recorded accurately in a special register. This unique idea led to the birth of the stock market. Amsterdam became the cradle of modern stock trading as we know it. The VOC revolution also lay in limited liability for directors. Directors did not have to use personal assets to pay debts. Shareholders only lost the maximum amount of capital they contributed. Thanks to these attractive policies, the first issuance was a success. In August 1602, over 1,000 investors signed up. 1,143 people registered in Amsterdam alone. The very last registrant was a woman named Neeltje Jacobs. She was a simple maid working for the merchant Dirk van Oos. After witnessing the stream of investors all month long, she decided to contribute 100 guilders of her own money. This was money that Neeltje had worked very hard to earn. Her salary at the time was less than 50 cents a day. She worked for nearly a year to save that 100 guilders. This action impacted the treasurer of the Amsterdam branch deeply. He rewarded his close servant with 50 guilders to invest more. When the final contributions were recorded, the notary wrote the conclusion. Under the witness of 2 people, all money was recorded transparently. The registered amount in Amsterdam was over 3.6 million. It accounted for 57% of the total initial capital. The total capital of the VOC was 6.4 million guilders. However, capital was not the strongest thing the VOC had. Its real weapon was the authority granted by the state. To compete with Portugal, the Dutch parliament allowed the VOC power. They could sign treaties with Asian courts on their own. They had the right to recruit soldiers and build massive fortresses. They could even conduct war whenever they deemed it necessary. A private company now possessed privileges belonging to a state. That power was demonstrated on the very first voyage out. Early morning on February 25, 1603, 3 Dutch warships spotted a Portuguese merchant vessel nearby. It was the Santa Catarina, anchored off the east of Singapore. This ship was on its way from Macau to Malacca with goods. It carried precious cargo from China and Japan in its hold. This included 1,200 bales of raw Chinese silk. The value was approximately 2.2 million guilders total. In addition, the ship carried dozens of kilograms of musk. This was a luxury item very popular in Europe at the time, being in a state of war with Spain and Portugal already. The order to attack was issued without any hesitation at all. Boom! After a few hours of fighting, the Dutch prevailed easily. With superior military force, the East Indies fleet won the day. All Portuguese goods were confiscated by the Dutch captains. Just a few months later, they allied with the English company. They captured another ship near Macau in a joint operation. The money from these 2 ships equaled half the initial capital. With finance in hand, the company built a permanent presence. In 1603, the first Dutch trading post appeared. It rose up at Bansum in West Java for the first time. This place was not just a simple trading station for goods. It was a springboard for the Dutch to lay foundations there. From Bansum, the company controlled the source of pepper supply. They negotiated directly with the local government for better terms. In 1605, the VOC fleet attacked again. Stephen van der Hagen captured the Portuguese fort at Ambon. This was the capital of the Moluccas, the Spice Islands. This place quickly turned into a major base for the VOC. It became their main trading center in Asia for a while. This strategic move helped the company monopolize clove trade later. Ambon was a key point on the Eurasian trade route map. Dutch soldiers were stationed right at the fort to guard it. Treaties were signed with local chiefs to consolidate their position. With growing assets and scale, the VOC made a decision. They appointed a governor-general to run trade in Asia. The Council of the Indies was born to supervise key positions. They watched over India and Sri Lanka and Indonesia and Malacca. Japan and Africa were also under their watchful eye. It seemed everything was beginning to stabilize for them. But after more than a decade of operation, limits appeared. Dividends were paid slowly because of the war with Spain. The cost of building administrative facilities in the East grew. Average profit was only about 5% per year then. This was much lower than the expectations of the investors. The revolving financial system of the VOC also had risks. Cash for each branch depended on the success of previous trips. When ships returned to Europe, goods were sold for profit. The proceeds were reinvested for the next scheduled voyages. If a ship met with an accident on the open sea, or if it fell into the hands of the Portuguese Navy, or if the demand for spices suddenly dropped in Europe, the VOC would face a serious shortage of financial liquidity. Jan Pieter Zoon took office as Governor-General in Asia. In 1618, he quickly realized this harsh reality. Relying only on the European market made the VOC passive. Meanwhile, the Asian financial market was vast and open. It had not yet been exploited to its full potential. Cohen believed military power must be applied directly there. He wanted to control the markets with an iron fist. This proposal initially met with fierce opposition from directors, but the Dutch parliament had a different view on the matter. They ordered company ships to be equipped with heavy weapons. They had to be ready for war at any moment, and Cohen was the man to lead them into darkness. The young Dutch Republic was still struggling for its independence then. Using the VOC as a strategic pawn to expand influence globally made sense. It was a logical move to assert power in other regions of the world. Furthermore, the threat from the Portuguese had never truly disappeared, and the English were also encroaching more aggressively on Dutch territories. In 1609, Captain William Keeling made a bold move. He established a trading post with defense systems for the English East India Company. This was at Banda, where they bought nutmeg directly from the locals. But the policy of trade by force set by the Dutch Parliament created pressure. It placed a heavy new burden on the shoulders of the VOC directors. The company now had to bear the costs of national military interests. In 1609 alone, military costs exceeded 400,000 guilders. This figure included building massive stone fortresses and buying new warships. Each warship cost about 100,000 guilders to construct and outfit. They also had to equip the entire fleet with heavy bronze cannons. The VOC sent a petition to the government complaining about these costs, but the government ignored it, and the company had to accept reality. They had to build a permanent foothold in Asia to survive the game. It would help establish sustainable trade relations and better bargaining power. It would also serve as a direct supply base for the Dutch fleet. And it would solve the short-term financial need for armed development. At this precise moment, the limitations of current trading posts appeared. The initial headquarters at Ambon was in the center of the Moluccas. It was convenient for purchasing goods, but terrible for logistics. It was too far from the shipping routes back to Europe. Goods had to travel more legs, which meant higher risks for everyone. Meanwhile, the Bansum station in the west near Malacca had problems. It faced constant confrontation with the local government and rivals. Chinese and English merchants competed fiercely there for every scrap of profit. Cohen, in his position as Governor General, decided to establish a new headquarters. This place would serve as the central administrative hub for the empire. It would gather goods and ship them back to Europe efficiently. A port on the north coast of Java was the target he chose. This location helped merchant ships avoid the disputed Malacca Strait entirely. It allowed them to control traffic through the strategic Sunda Strait instead. The port was located right at the mouth of the Siliwang River. This river led straight into the interior and provided abundant fresh water. In this area lay the ancient city of Jayakarta, a vital trade center. It was the forerunner of modern-day Jakarta in Indonesia. It was a hub for Arab and Chinese and Portuguese and English merchants. Since 1696, the Dutch had been building relations there. In 1610, after paying a large sum of money, they succeeded. The VOC was allowed to build a warehouse on the eastern bank. In subsequent years, Dutch ships often docked there for supplies. Initially, the local government was very wary of these strange visitors. They built fortifications to monitor Dutch activities across the riverbank. But over time, cooperation seemed to become more sustainable and trusted. The VOC strove to win the trust of the local administration. They signed a trade agreement in December 1614 for supplies. It allowed the company to buy rice and wine for their crews. The agreement brought huge financial benefits to the Jayakarta government too. But behind that friendly commercial move lay a dark ambition. The VOC silently turned its warehouse into a real fortress step by step. Wooden structures were replaced by solid stone walls overnight. They began stockpiling weapons and ammunition for the worst-case scenario. By May 1619, political instability in the region escalated sharply. There was a dispute between the Prince of Jayakarta and local lords. Taking advantage of the situation, Cohen commanded 16 ships to attack. He brought 1,300 soldiers from the Moluccas to the city. After 2 days of fighting, Jayakarta fell completely to the Dutch forces. The VOC's control of the entire city and burned it down. In 1621, the city was renamed Batavia to honor ancestors. It was named after the Batavian tribe, the ancestors of the Dutch. They expanded the fortress and warehouses to control all trade flow. Batavia became a solid springboard for VOC power across the Moluccas. Immediately after consolidating power at the new base, Cohen looked elsewhere. He turned the spearhead of his power toward the Banda Islands. This was the only place on Earth that supplied nutmeg back then. Since 1599, the Dutch had tried to impose monopolies there. They forced exclusive trade contracts on the local merchants of Banda. When the VOC was born, these ties became even tighter and harsher. The Banda people agreed to sign agreements on the surface only. In reality, they still secretly traded with the English and Malay merchants. Cohen considered that action a betrayal of the highest order. He used it as an excuse to launch a radical military campaign. His goal was to wipe out the free trade rights of Banda forever. In 1621, Cohen led a massive fleet to the islands. He had 13 large warships and 3 small ships and 6 boats. He commanded over 1,600 European soldiers and Japanese mercenaries. Banda forces and their English allies fired cannons at the VOC ships. The resistance was fierce, but Cohen had no intention of retreating. He ordered a landing on Montour, one of the main islands there. With overwhelming power, the island was controlled in less than a day. People fled into the deep forest to escape the Dutch wrath. The Banda elders were forced to sue for peace and accept demands. Yet ambushes by local forces continued, which made Cohen furious. And so the bloody war continued until the population was decimated. In that tragedy, 93% of Banda residents were killed. The survivors were enslaved and taken away to Java in chains. For modern Indonesians, this is still considered a genocide today. On July 12th, Qin returned to Batavia amidst loud cheers of victory. Cannons from the coast and offshore fired in unison to welcome him. He was hailed as a war hero and awarded 3,000 guilders. However, his excessive use of violence caused outrage back in the Netherlands. To save face, the authorities applied a symbolic administrative penalty on him. That did not affect Qin's position or power in the slightest. His actions opened the door to the golden age of the VOC. By now, the VOC was fundamentally a major world power entity. But to maintain the monopoly, they needed a more sustainable strategy. Trade from Europe to Asia was at a dead end at that time. Besides gold and silver, Westerners had no products the East wanted. These two precious metals were too scarce for the Dutch. Only Spain and Portugal had abundant supplies from South America. The Dutch had to gather silver by selling goods to European neighbors. Then they used that precious metal to exchange for spices in Asia. This made the VOC dependent on its rivals, whether it liked it or not. Faced with this situation, Governor Qin found a brilliant new solution. In a letter sent in August 1619 to the directors, he outlined a plan that would change the economic world forever. Gujarati cloth must be exchanged for pepper and gold in Sumatra. Pepper from Bansam would be exchanged for reals and cloth elsewhere. Chinese goods and gold would be exchanged for sandalwood and pepper. Silver from Japan could be exchanged for Chinese goods and silk. Cloth from the Coromandel coast would be exchanged for spices. Spanish dollars from Arabia would be exchanged for spices and small items. The exchange of goods between places would ensure value offset itself. All transactions would be done on ships without European silver. It was a closed-loop system of intra-Asian trade dominance. The VOC would become the carrier and the broker for all of Asia. They would buy low in one port and sell high in the next. The profit from one trade would fund the purchase for the next. This system would free them from the need for gold from home. It was the vision of a corporate empire that sustained itself. But Qin emphasized that they still needed initial capital to start, and that capital would come from the monopoly he had just secured. The blood of Banda would pay for the silk of China. The silver of Japan would pay for the cloth of India, and the VOC would sit in the center of the web. Qin saw a future where the company ruled the seas completely. His iron will had forged a path through fire and blood. The foundation of the first true global supply chain was laid. But the human cost of this efficiency was forgotten by history. Only the ledger books remained to tell the tale of profit, and the ghosts of Banda whispered in the nutmeg groves forever. To make the new system profitable, Qin demanded action from the directors. He requested a massive fleet of merchant ships and chests of silver. These resources were needed to build trust with native merchants initially. It was the spark required to start the engine of the intra-Asian trade. Parallel to this, Qin began establishing a network of fortified warehouses. He built relations with local traders using diplomacy when possible, or he used the crushing weight of military power when necessary. The coast of China was the first major target in his sights, specifically the Fujian province where trade was incredibly vibrant. The VOC tried to negotiate with local officials for a trading post, but this effort was blocked by the long-standing presence of the Portuguese. Their base in Macau gave them a political advantage the Dutch lacked. Faced with this wall, the VOC turned its eyes toward Japan. Luckily, the Tokugawa shogunate was looking for a new partner. They wanted to balance the overwhelming influence of Portugal in the region. In 1609, the Dutch received a trading permit. They set up a trading post at Hirado in the north. It was located about 80 kilometers from the main international port. This island was a bustling transit point for regional commerce. It connected trade routes from southern China to the Japanese market. Taking advantage of this, the VOC quickly imported Chinese silk. They also brought textiles and fabrics to the Japanese consumers. In return, they exported mother-of-pearl and deerskins from Siam. The exchange for Japanese silver was pushed to the limit, yet the ambition of the VOC regarding China had not ceased. From 1622 to 24, they launched campaigns. They tried to establish a trade base near the South China coast. The goal was to control the vital maritime artery directly. This route connected Fujian ports to Manila in the Philippines. It then extended to many other places in Southeast Asia. However, every single Dutch attack ended in miserable failure. The local defense systems were too solid to be breached. The complex terrain also prevented the Dutch from showing their power. In 1624, they changed direction to the island of Taiwan. This land stood guard over the route between China and Japan. The Dutch Navy used warships to bombard the coastal areas relentlessly. Meanwhile, VOC leaders negotiated with indigenous feudal lords. Finally, the ultimate goal was achieved with stone and mortar. Fort Zeelandia rose from the ground as a symbol of dominance. It became the most important VOC trading post in East Asia. It was also the largest fortress on Dutch soil abroad. From this base, the VOC expanded its control over the sea lanes. They dominated the route from Fujian to Manila with an iron fist. They also organized and backed state-sponsored piracy operations. They targeted rival fleets, especially the Portuguese merchant vessels. This strategy helped the VOC maximize profits from spice trade. Rice and silk and other precious goods flowed into their coffers. Beyond traditional goods, the VOC also exported culture. They popularized a new consumer culture in the controlled regions. For example, when they brought massive amounts of sugar to Japan, the demand for sweets skyrocketed among the Japanese people. This promoted the rapid development of the confectionery industry there. It changed tastes and eating habits forever in the land of the rising sun. At the same time, Arita porcelain from Japan traveled west, and Coromandel fabrics from India began to be shipped everywhere. Artisans in East and Southeast Asia learned from these designs. They copied patterns and techniques to create new hybrid products. This created a cultural interference that lasted for centuries. It influenced aesthetics and traditional crafts across the continent. By the mid-17th century, Japan changed its policy. The shogunate issued the Sakoku Edict, closing the country to foreigners. They restricted trade with the outside world almost completely. Most European merchants were banned from entering Japan instantly, except for the pragmatic businessmen of the VOC. Unlike the Portuguese and Spanish who brought religion with them, the Dutch company did not try to preach Christianity in Japan. The Tokugawa shogunate was very wary of missionary activities. They feared it would cause political instability and rebellion. Furthermore, the Dutch felt like genuine merchants to them. They focused solely on trading goods and making profit. Japan needed to import goods from Southeast Asia urgently. They also wanted to export silver and copper and handicrafts. The VOC was the most effective intermediary channel available, so the government allowed them to maintain a single trading post. This post was located on the artificial island of Deshima in Nagasaki. That policy turned the VOC into a monopoly bridge. They were the only link between Japan and the rest of Asia. This exclusive status lasted throughout the entire Edo period. In the latter half of the 17th century, they expanded further, taking advantage of economic and political fluctuations everywhere. The VOC pushed trade with Southeast Asia and South Asia. Earlier in 1610, they had seized Pulicat in India. They took it from the Portuguese to secure the textile supply. There they built warehouses and forts to ensure smooth operations. After a few decades, the VOC expanded to Bengal and Malabar. They also reached the Konkan coast to dominate the fabric market. These regions were famous for silk and indigo and exquisite calico. These fabrics were highly favored by the Dutch market back home. In Vietnam, as early as 1617, the VOC made contact. They reached out to the Nai Wan lords in the South Realm. Initial trade encountered many difficulties due to Dutch piracy. By 1633, the Nguyen lord allowed a trading post. It was established in Quai Nan to facilitate commerce. However, fierce competition with Portugal and Japan arose. This forced the company to turn its attention to the North Realm. In 1637, the Trinidad lord allowed a post in Fayin. Later, they moved to Quicho, the capital of the north. Here they coordinated with the northern court for military attacks. They launched assaults against the southern realm of the Nguyen. But by 1643, they failed miserably near Thuan. The company was forced to withdraw completely from the south. The VOC adjusted its strategy and expanded in Thailand instead. At Ayutthaya, they built a factory to collect local goods. They gathered deer skins and buffalo horns and cow hides. These were all exported to Japan to feed the hungry market. Parallel to expanding trade, the VOC pushed military campaigns. They aimed to gain dominance in other strategic regions. One of the most critical targets was the port of Malacca. It was located on the southwest coast of the Malay Peninsula. This place was the gateway for trade in the entire region. By the late 15th century, it was the busiest city in Southeast Asia. In 1497, the Portuguese first set foot there. They quickly realized the immense strategic value of this port. In 1511, they marched in and besieged the city. They defeated the Malay forces and began a brutal occupation. This occupation lasted for more than a century of dominance. The Portuguese turned Malacca into a military and commercial stronghold. They controlled shipping lanes and collected taxes from passing ships. Entering the 17th century, the VOC appeared as a challenger. They dared to challenge the established Portuguese power. In 1606, the VOC signed a treaty with Johor. The Dutch would be allowed to stay if they drove out the occupiers. However, the first siege by the VOC failed completely. The Portuguese fleet from Goa in India arrived to rescue the city. It was not until the 1630s that the tide turned. The Dutch began to control the strait effectively. In 1636, they sank a series of Portuguese ships. In June 1640, the VOC launched a massive siege. The Portuguese force had only about 2,000 men inside, but the fortress was incredibly solid and hard to crack. The walls were nearly 2.5 meters thick with towers. They had a large arsenal and dozens of heavy cannons. Meanwhile, the Dutch brought 12 warships and 6 boats. They had over 1,500 soldiers ready to fight. Soon after, they were reinforced by the Johor government. 40 ships and 1,500 soldiers joined the fray. The siege tightened like a noose around the neck of Malacca. The Dutch locked down the sea entrance to stop supplies. Inside Malacca, famine spread and disease broke out rampant. Both sides suffered heavy losses in the attrition war. On January 14, 1641, the VOC struck the final blow. Dutch troops crossed the river and stormed the fortress walls. The Portuguese era in the Straits had finally come to an end. The VOC flag rose over the ruins of the once great city, and a new master of the seas claimed the gateway to the east. The Dutch moved quickly to take down the remaining Portuguese positions. At that time, the Portuguese governor was critically ill and weak. Eventually, they were forced to surrender their stronghold unconditionally. Over 7,000 soldiers and civilians lost their lives there. Among the fallen were 1,500 Dutch men. This event marked the end of Portuguese dominance in the region. Their control over the Indian Ocean had finally been broken. From this moment, the Dutch ascended to the throne of commerce. Shipping lanes to Batavia were now tightly controlled by the company. The center of the VOC became the beating heart of Asia. Ports in India and China also fell under their strict supervision. Riding the wave of victory, the VOC sent a fleet. They surrounded Colombo, the capital of Sri Lanka, in 1658. The long siege forced the Portuguese to retreat from the city. By 1659, they were gone after a century of presence. Having captured Colombo, the VOC began to consolidate their power. They tightened control over the coastal regions of Sri Lanka. This included important ports like Gale, which they already held. They had controlled Gale since the year 1640. This victory gave the VOC a monopoly on the cinnamon trade. Cinnamon was a high-value commodity in Europe at that time. Throughout the 17th century, the Dutch company became dominant. They ruled the maritime routes from Europe to Asia completely. By 1669, the company owned a massive fleet. They had over 150 huge merchant ships sailing. Alongside them were 40 heavily armed warships for protection. This force did not just transport goods across the ocean. It was strong enough to confront other European powers head-on. They rivaled the Portuguese and the rising power of England. The commercial empire of the VOC stretched across the globe, from the Cape of Good Hope in Africa across the Indian Ocean, with bases in Sri Lanka and India solidifying their grip. They held a monopoly in Southeast Asia centered in Batavia. From Malacca, they reached out to Taiwan in the north, and they touched Japan at the furthest eastern point. A gigantic empire like this needed its own currency. Initially, the VOC had to use Spanish pesos for trade, or they used Indian rupees circulating in the Asian markets. However, they quickly realized this dependence was not enough. It could not satisfy their boundless ambition for wealth. The company decided to export coins minted by themselves. These coins were minted in Europe and shipped to Asia. They bore the VOC symbol in the crests of Dutch provinces. But a shortage of cash still occurred frequently. This was especially true in the bustling hub of Batavia. To solve this, in 1644, they granted a privilege. They allowed a Chinese craftsman named Qin Dynasty to mint coins. He minted copper coins with values of half and quarter stuver. A year later, the company continued to issue silver money. These silver coins had larger denominations for big transactions. By 1747, the Java rupee was released. It weighed heavy in the hand at 20.5 grams. It had a design simulating the Indian rupee for familiarity. It was engraved with Arabic script to serve the Islamic market. On January 15, 1768, production finally stopped. The quantity of coins had met the demand of the trade throughout its existence from the early 17th century onward. Until the end of the 18th century, the VOC was busy. They organized nearly 4,800 voyages across the sea. They transported millions of tons of goods between the continents. This was one of the most impressive logistical feats ever. It was a miracle of the pre-industrial era without a doubt. The VOC operated a gigantic machine of human resources. They had about 50,000 employees scattered across the world. This included sailors and merchants and managers and officials. It also included workers laboring in the warehouses and ports. Parallel to that, the company maintained a mercenary army. 10,000 soldiers served directly in their military campaigns. They protected ports and suppressed rebellions with brutal force. They expanded territory whenever the opportunity arose for them. Thanks to this military power, the VOC became a state. It was a political and military force equal to a nation. Many Dutch employees settled permanently in Asia over time. They married and integrated with the local indigenous communities. The result was the birth of the Indo-social class. These people became an important cultural bridge between worlds. They played a huge role in the pre-colonial history of Indonesia. The VOC was not just big in scale, but in profit. In peak periods, dividends fluctuated between 12 and 18%. There were times it reached 30 to 40% annually. This made VOC stock one of the most profitable investments. It was a legendary asset in the history of finance. The company even paid dividends in goods at certain times. Investors received cloves or pepper instead of gold coins. These spices had a value approximate to gold in Europe. The estimated value of the company at its peak, it reached 78 million Dutch guilders in total. If converted to current purchasing power, it is staggering. The VOC reached a valuation of over $10 trillion. This figure is many times the market cap of modern giants. It dwarfs companies like Apple or Microsoft significantly today. Although the conversion method is controversial, it is clear the financial scale of the VOC far exceeded everything. It surpassed every other economic entity in modern history. Thanks to these huge profits, the Netherlands flourished. The country entered its golden age of art and commerce. Port cities developed brilliantly with wealth flowing in. Amsterdam quickly became the leading financial center of the world. Their stock exchange became a pioneering model for everyone. It set the standard for modern stock markets to follow. Financial instruments like bonds and futures were developed there. Marine insurance was created to serve the risky trade. In fact, many corporate governance principles used today and modern investment strategies have their origins here. They stem from practices that the VOC laid the foundation for. The prosperity the VOC brought was not just economic. A large part of the huge profits was reinvested locally. Money went into public works and urban infrastructure projects. It helped turn Amsterdam and Rotterdam into bustling cities. Middelburg also became a modern city with canals and bridges. The greatest achievement the VOC left behind is globalization. It laid the foundation for globalization led by enterprises. For the first time in history, a trading company ruled. It had the ability to dominate the destiny of nations, controlling vital routes and shaping international trade models. The VOC paved the way for global capitalism to rise, and it also sowed the seeds of European imperialism in Asia. Of course, this success came with a very high price. VOC operations were linked to war and exploitation. Forced labor and economic inequality were part of the system. The echoes of this inequality last until today. Not only interested in building trading posts, the VOC also sponsored expeditions to new lands. This was part of the scientific exploration movement. It flourished during the Dutch Golden Age of discovery. The most prominent voyages involved two key explorers. Abel Tasman and Willem de Vlaming were the chosen ones. Abel Tasman became a VOC captain in 1634. The Governor-General of Batavia at that time was ambitious. Anthony van Diemen wanted to expand Dutch influence in Asia. In 1642, he assigned a mission to Tasman. Tasman commanded two ships named Heemskerk and Zeehan. They left Batavia heading south to find the unknown continent. In November of that same year, Tasman found land. He discovered the west coast of Tasmania today. Back then, it was named Van Diemen's Land to honor the governor. After continuing east, Tasman saw the South Island. He had discovered New Zealand for the European maps. In 1644, he left Batavia once again. The mission was to map the north and west of Australia. He was to find trade opportunities and assess settlement. Although he explored many new lands, it was disappointing. The voyage did not bring back the expected profit. New Holland, as the Dutch called it, was barren. It had no minerals or precious products to exploit. The second important expedition was by Willem de Vlaming. He undertook this mission in 1696. He was tasked with finding two missing VOC ships. Although there was no result in finding the lost ships, the expedition sailed along the western coast of Australia. They covered over 1,500 kilometers of coast. They set foot on Rottnest Island during the journey. De Vlaming named it after a small animal there. The animal looked like a rat to his eyes. Today it is known as the quokka, a marsupial. Next, the group went deep into the city of Perth. They explored the Swan River, which is a major river. Here, they saw something incredible for the first time. They witnessed black swans swimming in the water. This discovery made a strong impression on the Western mind. It challenged the long-standing Western belief forever. They had always believed that swans could only be white. In February 1697, de Vlaming found a treasure. It was a historical artifact left on a remote island. He discovered the pewter plate of Captain Dirk Hartog. Hartog had left it there in 1616 long ago. It marked one of the first times Europeans set foot there. They had touched the edge of the Australian continent. But after voyages that brought no profit home, the VOC gradually lost interest in this barren southern land. They only sent a few more ships later in the century. Expeditions were launched to survey the Gulf of Carpentaria. The purpose was merely to map the coastlines and rivers. They wanted charts for future navigation, not for settlement. Owning a monopoly network was not always a guarantee. Controlling supply in Asia did not mean controlling price. The VOC could not always keep sales prices profitable. The company had to balance its massive inventory carefully. Sometimes they had to destroy their own precious goods, or they had to shift cargo to other less profitable markets. If the price was too high, new rivals would appear. If the price was too low, the dividends would collapse. Therefore, the VOC pursued a goal of price stability. They chose medium-term stability over short-term gain. This strategy caused political costs to skyrocket uncontrollably. Military expenses began to eat into the company reserves. The ratio of soldiers in the VOC force increased drastically. It went from 30% in 1625 to 47% by 1688. Even though intra-Asian trade brought in good revenue, the burden of maintaining an empire was becoming too heavy. It gradually eroded the overall returns of the company. As early as the 1660s, directors were worried. The Gentleman 17 in Amsterdam began to fear the cost. The company was sinking deeper into military operations. Private ships of Dutch merchants had cheaper transport costs. They were leaner than the heavy-armed fleet of the VOC. This suspicion of inefficiency was not without cause. After 1670, profits began a steep decline. Part of the cause was the rise of England, and there were significant fluctuations in the Japanese market. The English East India Company was once a small rival, but they seized the opportunity when war broke out. England allied with France to attack the Dutch Republic. The disaster year, 1672, changed everything. When war occurred, trade stagnated and ports closed down. The flow of precious metals to the east was cut. The VOC had to withdraw warships to defend the homeland. Meanwhile, the English expanded trade with India aggressively. They quickly increased their market share in Europe. They jumped from 25% to 44%. This happened in just the decade of the 1670s. Not only England but France also joined the game. They established their own East India Company in 1664. Denmark followed suit shortly after in 1672. The Western market was soon flooded with pepper supply. This oversupply caused profits to plummet for everyone. To counter this, the VOC forced Bantam to close. They shut the port to rivals in 1680. Measures to tighten the pepper route were enforced strictly. In India, the VOC moved its base to Nagapatam. They did this to contain the French and Danish threat. By 1689, the VOC controlled the supply. They had secured the pepper supply network to Europe. But this monopoly was not sustainable in the long run. In the late 17th century, spices were king. They accounted for 57% of the profit. But by 1700, it dropped to 37%. The VOC focused too much on pepper and cloves. They missed the boat on highly profitable new industries. They ignored the rising demand for cotton textiles and tea. Another serious problem lay in the land of Japan. The Qin Dynasty consolidated power in China firmly. They captured Fort Zeelandia in Taiwan in 1662. This forced the Dutch to change their trade routes. They had to go to mainland Chinese ports for silk. Just 4 years later, China closed trade with the VOC. The company switched to importing Bengal silk for Japan. Initially, this trade was still very profitable for them. The Japanese buyers paid in gold and silver coins. But by the late 1660s, things changed drastically. The Tokugawa shogunate banned the export of precious metals. Profits plummeted seriously without the flow of silver. By 1685, Japan imposed strict trade quotas. When the source of Japanese silver was blocked completely, the entire intra-Asian trading network lost its profitability. Entering the 18th century, the company had to rely. They relied on silver from Europe to sustain operations. From the 1730s, the VOC fell into decline. The most prominent event occurred in Batavia. In 1740, the sugar market crashed hard. Chinese workers in the city became unemployed in masses. On October 7th, rumors of deportation began to spread. Panic spread through the Chinese community like wildfire. The result led to an uprising killing 50 Dutch soldiers. When news of this violent spread, tension exploded. Other ethnic groups in Batavia joined the chaos. They burned houses along the Canal of the Chinese. Dutch soldiers fired cannons in retaliation. Violence spread throughout the city uncontrollably. Thousands of Chinese people lost their lives that day. On October 11th, the Governor-General called a halt, but militia gangs continued to hunt down the victims. An estimated 10,000 people were killed in the massacre. At least 500 others were severely wounded there. These attacks ignited the Java War shortly after. From 1741 to 1743, war raged. Chinese and Javanese forces fought the Dutch army. After the massacre, the Governor-General was recalled. He was prosecuted back in the Netherlands for his crimes. The board of directors launched an official investigation. It was the first inquiry into colonial management. It showed the VOC was losing control of its territories. They could not manage the politics or the people. However, in the 1760s, there was a sign. The company showed unexpected signs of recovery briefly. The reason was, the VOC kept a neutral stance. England and France were entangled in the 7 Years' War. They fought on all fronts from navy to colonies. But these lights only flashed for a brief moment. By the mid-18th century, the VOC faced ruin. They faced core issues that could not be fixed. Dynasty changes in Persia and India created openings. England and France expanded their influence aggressively. They pushed the VOC out of key ports there. The Dutch commercial empire shrank to a smaller footprint. They only held Sri Lanka and the Indonesian archipelago. They controlled the Straits of Malacca and Sunda tightly. To compensate for losses, they increased taxes heavily. They raised revenue from 30 to 44%. The problem was military costs exceeded this revenue. For every 100 guilders collected in Asia, they needed 28 guilders of subsidy from Europe. Additionally, tea became important in trade with China. The quality of tea depended heavily on its freshness. Yet the VOC shipping process was far too slow. They shipped from Guangzhou via Batavia on Chinese junks. Then they reloaded before heading to Europe slowly. This inefficiency made them lose their competitive edge. They lost advantage in a booming market to England. At the same time, the VOC faced a crisis. They had a severe shortage of personnel and sailors. Their crew numbers were lower than private fleets. By 1770, 60% were foreigners. They had to recruit from outside the Dutch Republic. Not only sailors, but officers were hard to find. Unlike the English East India Company, which allowed trade, the VOC strictly limited personal trading for employees. This weakened the motivation to work hard. Work became just following orders for a fixed salary. Corruption spread to the highest levels inevitably. Employees sent metal money to the company for debt notes. They could cash these notes when they returned to Europe. The interest rate was high, but the VOC needed it. It supplemented their dwindling reserves of gold and silver. By the 1640s, the official trade was modest. The recorded value was about 1 million guilders annually. However, by the 1730s, this figure had skyrocketed. It jumped to 4 million guilders on the books. But much of this growth came from dark sources. It stemmed from smuggling and illegal private transactions. In the second half of the 18th century, things worsened. Many VOC merchants set up their own private smuggling rings. They trafficked opium into China for massive personal gain. This underground activity alone brought in 12 million guilders of profit went into private pockets. Naturally, the company knew nothing of this wealth. The VOC received absolutely no benefit from this trade. Worse yet, the company resources were being abused. Ships and men were used for private gain. This caused massive financial leakage for the corporation. The quality of leadership also began to decline sharply. In the early days, directors were skilled merchants. They were major shareholders who knew the trade well. But when the company performance began to stagnation, stock prices stopped rising and innovation halted completely. Talented merchants lost interest in serving the VOC. This created a vacuum for a different class. The wealthy aristocracy stepped in to buy large shares. To them, the VOC was merely a tool for power. It was a mechanism to distribute seats and privileges. By the year 1780, the change was complete. Out of 67 directors in the company board, only 6 were not from the noble aristocracy class. They possessed immense wealth and political influence. But they lacked the crucial commercial experience needed. This left the company helpless against coming crises. To finance their expensive naval voyages to Asia, The company had to take short-term loans in Amsterdam. They relied entirely on profits from returning fleets. By 1760, this debt had become unmanageable. It exceeded the projected revenue of the company. In 1780, the Dutch East India Company stood. It appeared to be a gigantic machine of commerce, but inside it was completely drained of all profit. Operations were sluggish and efficiency was dead. Yet on paper, they still claimed huge assets. They boasted a net capital of 62 million. This wealth was locked in ships and warehouses. Unfortunately, these assets were trapped in a broken system. The machine was too rusty to turn any profit. Vested interest groups within the company dug in. Competitive pressure from rivals squeezed them tight. Reform became an impossible task for the directors. On the coasts of Coromandel and Bengal, they lost. The British and French had overtaken them completely. The VOC was forced to accept a subordinate position. Back home, the financial situation was incredibly precarious. The VOC lost the power to dictate European prices. Then the true tragedy finally struck them hard. The Fourth Anglo-Dutch War broke out in 80. The British fleet hunted down the Dutch ships. They sank or captured half of the VOC fleet. This defeat cost them countless valuable cargo loads. It broke the political influence of the company in Asia. The direct damage from the war was catastrophic. It cost them 43 million guilders in losses. Helpless, the VOC had to beg for a bailout. They used their assets in Batavia as collateral. They asked the government for emergency financial aid. From 84 to 90, the state pumped money. 58 million guilders were injected into the corpse. But even this rescue could not change fate. When the Dutch Republic collapsed in 95, the Batavian Republic was formed by French revolutionaries. They decided to nationalize the entire VOC structure. In 1796, the directors were fired. Management was transferred to a new state committee. They handled affairs related to trade and colonies. The VOC charter was extended several times briefly, but on December 31, 1799, the charter officially expired and was not renewed. The giant finally died as the century ended. Most of the VOC colonies were seized by Britain. This happened during the chaotic Napoleonic Wars era. However, after the new Kingdom of the Netherlands formed, some territories were returned to the Dutch state. Looking back at history, no enterprise compares. No company ever reached such scale and power. The VOC left an indelible mark on the world. It shaped demographics and cultures across continents. It influenced languages and economies in Asia and Africa, and it fundamentally changed Europe itself forever. Its brilliant success and its heavy failure remain. They serve as a vivid lesson for us all. A lesson on the balance between innovation and duty, between endless growth and necessary sustainability. It shows that even the wealthiest corporation, the most powerful entity in human history, eventually falls. Nothing can resist the relentless flow of time. Will there be another corporation in the future? One that can usurp the position of the VOC? Or will the ghost of the VOC reign supreme? The first corporate empire remains the largest ever. Its shadow stretches across 4 centuries of history, from the Spice Islands to the stock exchange. The legacy of the VOC is a warning that greed can build an empire, but only integrity can sustain it through time. The ships have rotted and the forts crumbled, but the model they created rules the world. The joint stock company is their true child. We still live in the world they built, a world of global trade and corporate power. But let us not forget the cost paid in blood and iron and spices, the millions of lives touched by this giant. For better or for worse, they made history. They were the pioneers of globalization itself, and like all pioneers, they met a brutal end. The books are closed and the ledger finished. The final balance is 0 for the company, but the debt to history remains forever unpaid. The sun sets on the Dutch Golden Age, leaving only the echo of waves and gold.